back, and oh boy, do I have a treat for you. I got an interview with the head director of the Les Paul Foundation, Sue Baker. She knew Les Paul for the last decade of his life and was gracious enough to meet with me in the Waukesha Historical Museum, which is right next where Les Paul lived, and allowed me to interview her about the Wizard of Waukesha himself, Les Paul. So without further ado, I'm going to apologize for the rather airy quality of this recording, and let's get right into it. Sue Baker of the Les Paul Foundation, yes. I'm gonna ask her a few questions about her interactions with Les Paul, the famous Les Paul of Waukesha. So, tell the audience a little bit about the Les Paul Foundation. You know what they stand for. What they're...
Les Paul actually started his foundation, obviously before he died.
Obviously.
But he designed it to stay dormant until he passed. So he died in 2009, August 12th, 2009. And it took us 2 years to take care of the estate issues. And then January 2011, we started. The purpose of the Les Paul Foundation is basically to inspire other people by using Les's life. So we share Les Paul's legacy, his life, what he did, his inventions, and probably pretty importantly, his attitude towards life. And we use that to help other people. We give funds, we give money to nonprofit organizations. We ask every organization, how are you going to tell Les's story? And we have over 80 organizations across the United States that are actively connected with us, that are telling Les's story in different ways. Some of them are teaching music classes directly to students, primarily guitar and piano and keyboard and jazz and hip hop. They are teaching the recording industry to students. There's also, we give funding to an organization called Guitars for Vets, which they use guitars and guitar lessons to help vets who are struggling with post-traumatic stress syndrome.
I actually heard of that. A friend of mine, actually, his dad works for that organization. Yes.
Oh, that's great. It's a really phenomenal organization, and I was lucky enough to actually connect with them while Les was still alive. And Les was very enthused, so that's a natural for us. And we also give funding for research to find the cure for ringing in your ears. Because Les had that.
What's it called?
Tinnitus. And most of his guitar friends have it too, from being around music that's too loud.
Part of the trade.
That's basically what we do. We also preserve Les's. He has a lot of recordings that never were released, and we are digitizing those. We have photographs and videos. The last I checked, we were up like to 80,000. Yeah.
That's big numbers.
It is, of photographs and videos, and so we're in the process of identifying, okay, who's in the photo, when was it taken, and you'll see some of those right now are posted on our new website, which is www.les-paul.com.
Interesting.
So people can find more there.
It's very interesting. So I'm just going to start out with a very basic question. What was Les like as a person?
He was great fun. He was always fun to be with, a ready smile. He loved to tell jokes, always telling jokes. And when he was younger especially, he was a prankster. So he'd be always pulling practical jokes on people. Now, I didn't know him until the last 10 years of his life, so he was in his 80s, and there weren't quite as many practical jokes going on.
I can imagine.
But his shtick, if you will, when he was on stage was to play his guitar, of course, but he also would tell funny little stories and interact with the audience much more than you see most people do.
Yeah, I've seen a few of his stand-ups with Mary Ford, with them going back and forth for a while on stage while playing, and it's interesting, really.
Yeah.
You don't see that from other musicians.
No.
Ever. Les Paul obviously built the Les Paul for Gibson. How did that happen? How did that come about?
It started right here in Waukesha when Les was in high school. He was playing an acoustic guitar, and he was playing at Beekman's Barbecue, which was a drive-in type of place where you drive your car up and someone, what they called a car hop, would come and say, what can I get you? And you'd say, oh, a hamburger and a root beer or whatever. And then she would go get it and bring it back to your car, and they'd put a little tray on. And well, when Les was about 13, he convinced the Beekman family to let him play his guitar for tips. He didn't get any wages from Beekman's, but he got his tips. Well, for a 13-year-old, that's pretty cool, and especially because this was a recession. So he's playing his guitar, and it was an acoustic guitar. He called it his cheapie. It was a little inexpensive guitar, and people were saying, we can't really hear you. So he created his own electric guitar.
Was that the log?
No, this is before the log.
Before the log.
He took the arm off of his father's phonograph that had the needle in it. And this is, years ago, there were what were called LP, long playing. They were disc that you put them on a record player and you put the arm over the disc, and as the disc would spin, the music would come out. So Les took the arm off of that phonograph, took the needle and shoved it right into the bridge of his guitar, and then attached it to his mother's radio.
Huh.
And he electrified his guitar. And this would have been in about 1928.
So, whoa,
This is an electric guitar. It's not the
Wait.
solid body because it's a cheap acoustic guitar, but he electrified his acoustic guitar.
almost 100 years ago.
Yeah. And I said to him, how did that work? And he said,
It didn't.
It was okay. And he said, more people could hear me and my tips went up, and that's what I wanted. And he said, so that was good. But he said he got screeching, from this arrangement. And he also, if you've ever played a guitar, when you hold it against your body and you strum, you can feel the vibration of what they call the box of the guitar.
Yeah.
And he said, I didn't want to hear or feel the vibration of when I was playing. I didn't want to feel the box of the guitar vibrating. And so he said, okay, what do I have to do so I don't hear it? So the first thing he did, he said, I took socks and I stuffed them in my guitar, and he said, I took a tablecloth and I even took some underwear and stuffed it in there. And then I tried playing, and I said, and how did that go? And he said, it didn't, it was horrible. He said, so then I decided to pour plaster of Paris in. Solid body guitar.
Oh.
Plaster of Paris. And I said, how did that work? He laughed and said I needed to get a new guitar.
That's
So
interesting.
that was the first, and that didn't work, but that was a step. So the next thing he thought was, okay, that didn't work. What's the densest material that I can think of to build a guitar? Well, Les lived across the street from a railroad track.
Oh.
And back in the 1920s, the railroad guys would come by, and if they saw a flaw or damage on a part of the rail, they would literally cut it out and just throw it nearby. So Les said, well, I got 5 of my buddies, and we borrowed a wagon, and we went down the slope. Now, if you know Waukesha, this is where the Wisconsin Avenue Bridge crosses the Fox River, right across from Golden Chicken.
Yeah.
So if you know that area, you know that bank is really, really steep.
It must have been hard to drag all that stuff up.
Oh, yeah. So he told me, I got my buddies, and they took the wagon down the slope, and I told my buddies to pick up a 2-foot piece of rail and put it in the wagon, and then I told them, okay, now take it back to my house, which was across the street. And I said, Les, wait a minute. This is your project, and you're telling me your buddies got the wagon, your buddies took the wagon down the hill, your buddies picked up the rail, your buddies took that back to your house. What were you doing? He said, well, somebody had to be in charge.
Well, it worked, didn't it?
It did. So then he also had picked up 2 spikes. That's the big, heavy. Okay, you know what a spike is. So he put the rail down. He took 2 spikes, put 1 at each end, and then he stretched a guitar string between the 2 spikes, and he took the microphone out of his mother's telephone. Now this was a candlestick telephone. That's a real old-fashioned one. They're always black, the original ones. And it looks like a candlestick, and it has, you take one part, you put it by your ear, and the other part you speak into. Well, he took the microphone, the part you'd speak into, out of his mom's telephone, stuck it underneath, and then he plucked the string. And he said, the sustain was phenomenal. The sound was so clear. And then he called out to his mom, Mom, you gotta come hear this. I just invented a solid body electric guitar. Did I mention that he had attached this to his mom's radio?
Yeah.
Solid body electric guitar.
So not only did he make the first solid body electric guitar, he also made an amplifier for it, which was the radio.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right.
How old was he?
He would have been about 15 at that time. Yeah.
Wow.
So his mother, who usually was very, very supportive, came in, took one look at this chunk of rail, and said to Les, the day you see a cowboy sitting on a horse with a chunk of rail, I don't think so, Les. I said, how did you feel when she said that? And he said, I was really disappointed, but I knew she was right. But that would have been in about roughly 1932. Well, by that time, that's when he started his performing career. So he's traveling from St. Louis, or from Waukesha to St. Louis to Springfield, Missouri, up to Chicago, and all this time, when he's performing, he's thinking about how great that rail sounded. 1942, he's in New York. He's performing with the Fred Waring Orchestra, and he's thinking about that rail. So he worked out something with the people at the Epiphone factory.
Yes.
And he got to use all of their equipment on Sundays. And so he said, I was working, I kept thinking, how can I recreate that sound I got on that rail and make it practical to carry around? And that's where he invented the log.
The log, yes, the
log.
famous log.
The famous log.
Where does that currently reside?
The log is at the Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville, the original one. Now there's another log that Les made that's right here in the Waukesha County Museum. And the one here, he actually made. There's other copies of the log in various museums, including the one at Discovery World that other people made. And they look similar. You can understand the concept of the log by looking at these. But the one here at the Waukesha County Museum is one that Les actually made.
Yeah.
Which is very cool.
Actually.
Yeah.
The log 2.0.
Yes, exactly.
So he got up with Epiphone and then he made the log. Didn't they, people at Epiphone, call it a piece of trash?
Well, not exactly. He approached Epiphone first and said, look, solid body electric guitars are going to be the wave of the future. And they looked at him and they said, that's not really the kind of product that we create. He said, okay. So then he went to Gibson. And Gibson looked at the log and they laughed him out of the room. Les found out years later that they referred to Les as the guy with the broomstick with a couple of pickups on it. They called the log a broomstick.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing for all of us to remember, that if we come up with an idea that we think is good and people laugh at it, excuse me, that doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means those people, that those people don't like the idea. It doesn't mean the idea is bad.
Yeah.
And that's something we can learn from Les. Les didn't take no as a final answer. He kept going back to Gibson for 10 years. I'm telling you guys, this is the wave of the future, solid body electric guitar. And they kept laughing at him. In the meantime, Les moved to Hollywood, and he became good friends with Leo Fender.
Ah, yes.
And also Paul Bigsby.
Yeah, he made, there was a lawsuit back in the day with Bigsby suing Fender for the original idea of the Telecaster. Because if you look at Bigsby's original guitar, it's very similar. The headstock and everything, very similar to Fender guitars.
Well, could be because the three guys spent a lot of time together. Les said that when he was in Hollywood, he lived in a little tiny house. But he said, I had a really big backyard with a fireplace in the backyard, and he said the three of us would sit around. And we were talking about, we all agreed that solid body electric guitars were the wave of the future. He said at one point, Leo approached Les and said, Les, look, the only way we're going to get these solid body electric guitars on the market is for you and I to go into business, and we'll call it the Fender Paul Guitar Company, and we'll create our idea. And when Les told me that, I said, what did you say? He said, I told Leo I had to think about it. And he said, I really seriously thought about doing that. He said, I thought about it overnight, and then I called Leo and I said, you know, I've had this relationship with Gibson, and I'm really convinced they're going to come around. So I think I'll say no. And Leo said, okay, Les, but I'm going forward. And that's how
Fender.
Yep, that's how the Fender company
One
started.
of the biggest guitar companies, if not the biggest.
There's sort of a back and forth between Gibson and Fender.
It's
constantly.
the two.
Yeah. But I think it's important to understand that Leo Fender and Les Paul were friends. And I have photos of the two of them standing together with their arms around each other and smiling. So, was there competition? Sure, but it was friendly competition.
So after that, Les Paul, he went into show business and met Mary Ford. And during their series of shows, they got in a car accident. What happened there?
That was actually before the shows.
No?
They were living in Hollywood at the time. They came back to Waukesha to visit family. And Les said, when they were in Waukesha, they actually were supposed to go to Chicago to perform at the Blue Note. And he said, I was running a fever. I felt awful. And they were driving their convertible. And Les said to Mary, you gotta drive. I can't drive. This is the end of January. Mary has lived all of her life in Southern California. She has no idea how to drive on snow and ice. So they're going from Waukesha, and they're going down Highway 66, which is the big road that goes from Chicago to LA. Yeah. So they're driving down, and they're in Oklahoma. And keep in mind, this was pre-seatbelts. This would have been in January of 1948. And Les said, I'm laying down on the front seat and I'm just feeling awful. We have the radio on, and they're saying on the radio, like we're used to hearing, if you don't have to be on the road, don't be on the road, because the weather's bad. And Mary said, Les, these roads are really bad. I really think we should stop. And he said, we'll just go a little further. When we get to Oklahoma City, we'll get a hotel and we'll just, camp out. Well, they never got to Oklahoma City. He said, but they're driving along, and he said, all of a sudden Mary screams. And he said, I popped up out of the seat, and I see us going over a bridge. He said, I grabbed the steering wheel, pulled it back. I slammed my foot on top of her foot on the brake. And he said, for just a moment, we were back on the bridge. But then we hit another patch of ice. And over, and imagine, of course, no seatbelts, it's a convertible. They both went through the roof of the convertible. The car landed upside down on a frozen riverbed. So in some respects, it was better that they were pushed out of the car, because they probably would have died. But so they're on this frozen riverbed, and they're out in the middle of nowhere. And Les said the only reason anyone found us is when they went over, they happened to hit an electrical line. People lost their electricity. The electric company found the two of them. They sent 2 ambulances. One of the ambulances broke down. Les said, take Mary. Well, Mary had, I think it was broken her pelvis and some other not so serious, few scratches on her face, but not bad. But Les was in really bad shape. He said that when they were going over, he said, I instinctively reached my right arm over in front of her face. And I said, why did you do that? And he said, because she was so beautiful, I didn't want her face to be ruined. Mm-hmm. And so they obviously were separated as they went out. He landed on his right elbow on that frozen river and totally shattered his right elbow. Yeah. So when he's in the hospital, and he didn't just shatter the right elbow, he broke his back, his pelvis, and there's just a whole string of things that he broke. So he's in the hospital. They did the surgery to sort of, stabilize him. He said, I'm in the hospital, and I'm hearing two doctors in the hallway arguing. And the one doctor's saying, we got to amputate that arm. There's no way we can save that right arm. And the other doctor is saying, he's not a truck driver. This is Les Paul. And he's played with Fred Waring, and he's got some records out. He's a rising star. You can't do that. And back and forth, back and forth. Les said, finally the two doctors walk in his room. Mm-hmm. And he points to the doctor who was wanting to amputate his arm and said, you are out of here. They didn't have the wherewithal in Oklahoma to fix his arm the way Les wanted it. Mm-hmm. So they flew him with a doctor and several nurses to Hollywood, where they were able to set his arm. And you probably have heard the story that it's set in a 90-degree angle.
Yeah, right there.
Because Les had the option of, we can fix it so that you can move it, but you'll have to be under surgery every 10 years. Or we can put it in one position and leave it. Les said, put it so I can play my guitar. And so that's how he was. But it didn't look that weird. If someone hadn't told me that ahead of time before I met him, I probably wouldn't have noticed, because think about it, not many of us walk around with our arms straight. Yeah. Usually they're bent one way or another. Yeah. And of course that's allowed him to play.
Did Les Paul have a favorite guitar, perchance? If he did, where is it?
Yes. It's what he called the Bible. It's a black guitar, and right now it's at Discovery World in Milwaukee. And when Les had his guitars, he was notorious for always literally cutting them apart. He was always experimenting with it. He was constantly winding pickups or having his kids wind pickups. For what is your chore? Well, I had to wind pickups for my dad. But he was always trying new things. But he never never adjusted the Bible. That was his benchmark. He'd experiment, and then to try to get the sound he wanted, he would listen to the guitar he was experimenting on and compare it to how the Bible sounded. So that was, I don't know if I'd say it was his favorite, but certainly that was very important. Uh-huh. And when he was younger, before the Gibson Les Paul came out, he had a favorite guitar then too, and he, like what he did with the Bible, he kept one pristine, if you will, and he had two more exactly like it. And he'd experiment and cut and do all kinds of things, but then he'd always refer back to the one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Speaking of the Les Paul, how did the Les Paul guitar that we know come to be?
Well, it's the concept is based on the log. The concept of a solid body electric guitar, because up until then Gibson was making hollow bodies, and obviously for 10 years they were extremely skeptical of creating a solid body electric guitar. So when Les took the log into Gibson, after that, when Gibson accepted the idea of a solid body electric guitar, then Les worked with Gibson. The Gibson designers did a lot of the work, but Les kept giving comments, ideas, suggestions. Mm-hmm. No, do this. No, I would rather you did this. And so that was his input. It's more than just his name on the guitar. He was involved with the design.
Of course. Did Les Paul ever come back to Waukesha and,
Multiple times. Multiple times. Because his family lived here, and he would come back to visit his family. There's a number of newspaper articles talking about times that Les Paul came back, but he came back many, many more times than that. And he said, a lot of times I'd come and I'd try to be quiet because I just wanted to spend time with my friends and my family, and I didn't want the newspapers and the other media to be announcing it, because then I'd have no time with my family.
Yeah.
Everybody would want to interact with me. But one of the things that I think was pretty big, Les came back in the 1960s when Catholic Memorial opened its gym, and they had a concert, and Les and Mary came and brought their kids actually too, at least the younger ones, and performed there. In 1988, Les's mother turned 100,
Whoa.
and she was still alive.
That's it.
The city of Waukesha threw a big party, and Les and his trio came and performed.
Wow.
So he came then. He came other times. He was here in this museum in 2004. He came.
In this very building.
This very building. And 2007 he came here, and he was so generous. That was when he came and did a concert as a fundraiser for the Les Paul exhibit. And then the day after that, he came here and he had lunch with everybody who was on staff.
Wow.
And when I say on staff, I mean all the volunteers plus the paid people.
Wow.
One of the fun things that happened before he came here in 2007 was I promised him that I would show him some spots in Waukesha that he had asked me to look up. And so the very first person who ever took the Les Paul Waukesha tour was Les Paul. And I said to him, did I get it right, Les? And he said, you got it all. So I feel real confident that anybody who follows that Les Paul tour that's on that little trifold brochure, it's accurate.
Les did it himself. Les did it himself.
Yes.
The thing about him is from what you've told me, he seemed a lot more down to earth than a lot of other people who went to the extent that he did, as far as he did.
Very much so. When I've traveled to various places around the United States and given presentations on Les or had meetings, people time after time have said to me, Les Paul never lost his Midwest charm. And after about the third time I heard that, I said, I'm going to have to stop you because I've lived in the upper Midwest all my life, and I'm not sure what you mean by Midwest charm. And they said, oh, a lot of famous people get very full of themselves. They think they're really important and they're better than everybody else. Mm-hmm. And Les never treated anyone like that. Mm-hmm. I have been with him where I saw him talking 1 minute to Steve Miller and with respect and caring and all that, and the next minute he can turn and talk to a cleaning person with the same level of respect and interest.
Yeah, that's really something.
Yeah.
A lot of people get full of themselves after they really go as far as he did. He was extremely important in the world of manufacturing, playing, building guitars in general.
You got it.
Guitar would not be the place it is without him.
Music wouldn't be, because the guitar, a lot of people know about the solid body electric guitar that has his name on it, but musicians will tell you it's his inventions related to recording that really changed the industry, because he's the one who developed sound on sound, layered sound, and how to use echo and reverb and phase shifting and all of those techniques that recording artists use all the time now. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, he is the only person who's in both the National Inventors Hall of Fame and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
That's either one of those is an achievement, let me tell you. That's wow. You said he knew Leo Fender. How did that relationship sort of come to be?
It's because they both lived in Hollywood at the same time, and I don't know exactly where Leo lived. but it must have been somewhat nearby. And so I don't know how they met. I just know that they were friends and talked about solid body electric guitars a lot.
Wow.
But he was figuring out stuff way before that. He talked about, he grew up in a single parent household. His parents got divorced when he was 5. And his mother was very accepting of what he did, to the point of one time when he was telling me of some of the things he did, I said, you know, I'm talking to you as someone who's a mother, and I'm telling you, you had the right mother, because in my house, that wouldn't have flown.
That would be gone.
Yeah, but probably one of the most significant experiments he did, he was about 10. His mother had allowed him to take apart her telephone, obviously. He had taken apart the vacuum cleaner. Basically, anything that came apart, he took apart, because he wanted to see how it worked. Well, his mother had saved her money and had gotten a player piano. And she said, Lester, she always called him Lester, I know you like to take things apart, and it's okay to take things apart, but please, please do not take apart my piano. I said, oh, Les, no, tell me you didn't. He said, but Sue, I had to. I said, oh my gosh. So I said, all right, tell me the story. And he said, well, I waited till Mom went grocery shopping. He said, I took a sheet, and I presume he meant like a bed sheet. He said, I spread it on the living room floor, and as I took the piano apart, I put the parts in order so I could put them back together in order. He said, I just had to find out how this thing worked.
Mm-hmm.
I said, then what? He said, the front door opened. He said, my mother came home early. And I'm thinking, oh, he's going to say that she really went into a fit. And I said, what happened? He said, she didn't say a word. She just stood there, and he said tears rolled down her face. And then she walked out of the room.
Whoa.
I said, how did you feel, Les? He said, I felt really awful. And I said, and well, you should have.
I can imagine.
Yeah, this is a woman who has very little. She's supporting herself and 2 boys on $6 a week. She saves her money to get this piano, and the first thing her son does is take it apart. So then I said, okay, then what happened? He said, well, I put it back together. And he said, my mom called the piano repair person. And according to Les, the guy said, it's better than new.
So you proved it well.
But that piano was key, because he was fascinated by how when you pump the pedals and you watch the roll go around, how it played, the little holes made music. Mm-hmm. And he was fascinated by that. So he took one roll, and he said, I put tape over some of the holes, and I punched other holes in. And this is what he did, you know, at the beginning and the end of the rolls, there's always some blank parts.
Yeah.
So he was doing most of the work there. And he said, then I moved into where there already were holes. He said, and I was listening, he said, and when I didn't like how it sounded, I put a piece of tape over it. He said, I ran out of tape and I used Band-Aids. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how this roll must have looked. But his son, who is a recording engineer, has his own recording studio, said to me, that was where my dad learned about sound on sound, because he took a piece of music that was on the piano roll and he added tunes to it. He was layering music. That was his very first experiment, and he was about 10 years old.
10 years old. Doing more than what modern engineers can even dream of. Didn't they call Les the Red something?
Red something. Les had red hair. Mm-hmm. And his dad called him Red. He had other names for him, but most of the time he called him Red. And when Les started performing, and this would have been before he was 13, so maybe even 10 or 11, he was known as Red Hot Red.
Ah, that's it.
And there's a photograph, and you've seen a copy of it, where from, what year was that? He had just turned 14, and he had a float in the Waukesha Parade, and the big banner over it says Red Hot Red and his something or other. They won first place in that parade. But, so that's how he went by, it was Red Hot Red, and he used that name when he went to St. Louis. He was using that name. By the time he got to Springfield, Missouri, which is a little further west, a little further south, they didn't like that name. Not sure why. Some people have speculated because too many dogs were called Red Hot or whatever. Any rate, that's where his friend Sonny Joe Wolverton said, well, you like this guy named Pie Plant Pete. That was one of Les's idols. It was the guy's stage name. Well, another name for rhubarb is pie plant, which I didn't know until a few years ago. So in order to honor Pie Plant Pete, Les changed his stage name to Rhubarb Red. So he went by that name for a while. And it was when he was in Chicago, this would have been in the early 1940s, he played hillbilly music as Rhubarb Red. And then at night, he was playing jazz, and he couldn't use the name Rhubarb Red to play jazz. It wasn't believable.
Yeah.
That's where he became Les Paul.
Back to the Les Paul. What was his initial reaction on the first sending off of the Golden Top?
So you're talking about the first gold top that Gibson sent him? He wasn't happy. They had the pickups too high, and so the first thing he did was take a knife and cut out part of the guitar, this brand new prototype, and push the pickups down lower so it would play right. So that's what he did the whole time. Every time Gibson created a new version of the Les Paul guitar, they'd send it to him, and almost always he'd be tinkering with it and adjusting this and adjusting that and sending it back to Gibson and say, change this, change that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the interview. If there's anything else you'd like to say.
I hope that people will visit the Les Paul Foundation website, which is les-paul.com. Explore everything. You can print out free posters. There's lots of fun things under the education tab. There's fun things to do. There's a crossword puzzle. There's a word find. Lots of interesting information.
Thank you all for tuning into the interview. We got more stuff like this coming up. And hey, if you enjoyed this, then go on over and describe or follow, depending on what platform you listen to everyone's favorite bass-hating, guitar-playing lunatic. But seriously, thanks for listening, and I'll see you all next time.